say all the time that we can't do this work without being in community with one another and building connections and relationships. And that can be harder to do, of course, on Zoom, but it's also possible. So it's, I hope you'll scroll through the faces and take notes of names and share comments in the chat. And just as we might in a meeting whispering to our neighbor, now you can choose someone all the way across the room to, send a note to in the chat privately or send something to the group. Principal Stimson, I see you there. It's nice to have you join us. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Sherry Weish, who is the co-chair of our program leadership team, to get us started. Sherry.
Thank you so much, Winston, and good afternoon to everybody else on the screen. Giving a huge, huge shout out to my homie, my partner in GEA Crime, co-chair Ruthann May. Ruthann, thank you for your guidance, for your feedback, and for your awesome ability to facilitate. And finally, thank you to the High Point Schools Partnership, whose work makes space for events like this one today. So thank you, High Point Schools Partnership. Let me paint a clear picture of how this event came about first. So at GEA, we believe that great communities have great public schools. Our work is laser focused on helping to maintain a vibrant public school system where all children thrive and are prepared for the future. The High Point Schools Partnership is affiliated with GEA and focuses on creating impactful connections between the community and GCS schools located in High Point. So that's kind of how this story came about. I am beyond excited to be in this space with y'all today. I don't think there is anything more important for us to focus on. And in a few weeks, my wife and I will become first-time moms. And it makes me so proud to know that we are doing the work right now and making decisions right now that will impact my child's future life. And like all parents, we all want our students to have bright futures. So let's get into it. Dr. Blosser is a member of the GEA Board of Directors. He's the co-chair of High Point Schools Partnership, and he is a professor at my alma mater, Panther Pride, High Point University. He is going to facilitate this conversation with Dr. Sharon Contreras. We will also hear data presented by the amazing GCS Chief Academic Officer, my good friend, Dr. Whitney Oakley. And of course, Dr. Sharon Contreras is with us, and we are so lucky to have her in this leadership role. Let me tell y'all, we are so lucky to have her in this leadership role. She is recognized across the country as a leader in public education and understanding how we can change outcomes for students, especially students of color who are impacted by our system's instructors. I hope that you have come to this space vulnerable and ready to make change happen in your current sphere of influence. Dr. Oakley, you ready, friend? I'm going to pass it right along to you. You'll share your data, and then Dr. Blosser and Dr. Contreras will help us to dive deeper into this very important conversation. Let's go.
Good afternoon. I believe that Karen is going to drive. Is that still the case in terms of screen sharing? It is still the case. Thank you, Karen. And thanks so much for having us today for this really important conversation. Just to set some context before the anticipated Q&A with our superintendent, we wanted to share some student performance data, some that's district-wide and some that's specific to our High Point schools. So we'll dive right in. It's really important this year more than ever to think about some considerations that are realities when we look at test scores. Across the country, this is consistent. We're having lower student participation rates across all of our assessments. That's true for our elementary assessments, our middle school assessments, and our high school assessments. So we have fewer students participating in assessments as a result of school closure after COVID-19, as a result of the number of families who are still in remote learning. So keep in mind when we're looking at these results that this represents fewer students than in past years. Also important to remember testing conditions. Some test results we'll point out were taken in person. versus those that were taken remotely. We know, and it's true again with standardized assessments and informal assessments, that our most reliable results are taken in person under secure testing conditions. We also want to keep in mind that we had voluntary kindergarten return for half days on October 5th here in Guilford County. We had pre-K through second grade all return for full days, November 12th, with the exception of those students who chose to remain in the remote option. Our third through 12th grade students who were in our self-contained exceptional children's classrooms and in our 4 public separate schools returned on November 16th. And then our 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade students who opted to return face-to-face came back on January the 5th. We also do have virtual schools, a K-5 and a 6-8 virtual academy. And we're also seeing some skewed results there just because, again, of the the testing remotely, the results seem to vary. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into each assessment piece. This year, for the first time, we're administering the NWEA MAP growth assessment. This is given to tens of thousands of students across the country. This is the best assessment that's out there to be able to diagnose where students are and what gaps that they have. We gave this assessment to our kindergarten first and second graders in the winter, and we did a strong campaign led by our superintendent to make sure we gave this face-to-face to as many students as we possibly could so that we would have the best data that we could. Our preliminary results showed that 44% of our kindergarten through second grade students scored average or above average in reading. We're waiting on being able to compare this nationwide. We should have that information by the end of this month. What's remarkable here is that the kids who were in school just 5 weeks more outperformed other student groups. So our kindergarteners had 5 more weeks of in-person instruction, and they had the highest rate of students scoring average or above average in reading. So we know that being in school face-to-face, particularly for our youngest and our most vulnerable kids who have not yet established those foundational skills, are benefiting, and this data shows it, from face-to-face instruction. The next slide looks a little bit at the different grade levels in terms of reading performance, and you can see there that kindergarten outperformed first and second graders who had not yet been in school for as long when they took the assessment. When we move into the next slide, it's disaggregated by racial group. You'll see here, and we see this across data sets, that our students of color are performing at lower rates across all assessments than our white students. Our Hispanic student group stands out across these assessments as those students who were very negatively impacted during the remote learning period. These racial gaps persist across subject areas. They persist when we control for poverty, and they persist when we look across grade spans from elementary to middle to high schools. When we look at math data, this is very consistent with the rest of the nation and what we're seeing from other large urban districts. The greatest learning loss that students have experienced is in the subject of math. And that we saw that too. Only 38% of our kindergarten through second graders scored at average or above average rates in math. But again, those extra 5 weeks that our kindergartners had in the face-to-face environment made a difference. Our kindergartners in math were 15 percentage points higher than their counterparts who were in first and second grade who did not have those 5 weeks of instruction. We'll look at similar breakdowns here for math. You can see the jump in kindergarten compared to first and second grade students on their math assessment. When we look by race, similar patterns. Only 28.4% of our Black students and only 24.7% of our Hispanic students scoring average or above average on their math assessment. We'll shift now to high school. Want you to remember what we shared at the very beginning. We had fewer high school students taking these assessments than we have in past years. And when we look at our high schools that have test data, it's only our block high schools, our high schools that are on the block schedule. Our traditional high school students who take those year-long courses, we won't have their assessment data until June or July, because they'll take their end of course test at the end of the whole academic year. When we look at our fall block end of course assessment performance, again, lower participation, lower performance, huge declines in math. The Math 1 scores are staggering, and we're going to look at those in a few minutes. Math 1 is a predictor of life outcomes for students. So this is a particularly troubling data point, and one that we're going to need to continue to attack for years to come. Our smallest performance decline was in English 2 with only a 4.3 percentage point decline. There's no consistent trends here in the high school space, except that in most cases, the largest declines in performance on end of course proficiency were found among our Black and Hispanic students. EOC's end of course tests are given in Math 1, Math 3, Biology, and English 2. Those are the subject areas that our state requires us to provide those tests in. And if you look here, in 2021, only 7% of the students who took the Math 1 assessment in high school showed proficiency, which means 93% of the students who took the test did not. The Math 3 number is only a quarter of our students. A third of biology students showed proficiency, and about half of our students who took the English 2 assessment showed proficiency. We'll look at this breakdown by race. It follows similar patterns as the elementary assessments, with only 6.8% of Black students showing proficiency, just under 4% of Hispanic students, 11.5% of white students, and 7% for our other racial groups. The yellow bar shows where these student groups performed on the same assessment last year at the fall EOC. Looking at Math 3, slightly higher, but the same gaps persist, with only 14% of Black students, 19% of Hispanic, compared to their 37% of their white counterparts. The next slide shows biology performance. Again, math is lower than all other subject areas, including science in our high schools. 25% of our Black students passed the biology fall end of course test, compared to 42.6% last year. Same number for our Hispanic, 25.1% of our students, while 48.3% of white students who took the assessment scored at proficient levels. The next assessment is English 2 that's tested as a high school end of course test. Our English 2, we saw the gaps did not decline quite as drastically as they did in math and biology, with 39.6% of Black students scoring at proficient rates, 45% of Hispanic students, compared to 72.3% of white students, which is actually higher than they performed last year when we were following a regular schedule. So it's important to look at how this data has been impacted by school closure and how disproportionately it has affected racial groups. This chart just looks across, and really it shows the drastic differences in the changes in participation. So that's what I would call your attention to here. We can use Math 1 as an example and just go left to right on your screen. 1,018 students were enrolled in Math 1 in the fall. 900 in 1920, 994 of those tested, compared to this year, 2021, where we had 900 students enrolled, but only 608 tested. So that really points out kind of that drop in participation. We had a 67% participation rate, so we dropped 30% in terms of participation rate, and only 7% proficient compared to 26% proficient last year. So this chart just shows those sharp declines from 1920 to 2021. We broke down this data piece by high point schools. That's something that we can do pretty easily for our high point high schools who follow that block schedule. So just want to make sure that you can see that here. Before we get into that, there's a question in the chat. These state assessments are required in person, face-to-face. The state has not given a waiver to not administer the assessments. They extended the window till the end of the academic year. But if you think about a student in a block high school who took Math 3 in the fall, waiting till June to take the test on what you learned in the fall is probably not going to positively impact performance. That's a long time from when you take the course to when you take the test. But these state end of course tests, to answer your question, are required to be taken in person. This looks specifically at our high schools that follow the block schedule, and they follow the same trends when we look at the whole county. With only 11% of students proficient in Math 1 compared to 39% the prior year and 29% in 18-19. 20% of high point fall EOC proficiency in Math 3, 33% biology, and just over 51% in English 2. So again, sharpest declines in math, lowest numbers in Math 1, and these are consistent when we look at the overall county. When we look at student grades, there's similar data trends that follow the rest of the nation here. In 2021, our students are receiving lower grades, fewer A's and B's, more C's, D's, F's, and incompletes. That's true when we compare to previous years, both in the first quarter, the second quarter, and the first semester. Students of color are more likely to receive a failing grade than white students, and among our larger groups of students of color, Hispanic students have the largest increase in course failure rates. This chart shows the percentage of students who failed at least one. So they could have failed more than one second quarter course, and it compares last academic year, 1920, to our current academic year, 2021. You can see here the increase in failure rates, 39% for our Black students, all the way to 45% for our Hispanic students. Overall, 34% of GCS students failed at least one quarter two course, compared to 28% in 1920. At this point, Dr. Blosser, I think I pass the baton to you to transition us, and I'm happy to answer questions about the data points, or we can do that as we dialogue in the next part of the agenda.
I think we'll dive into Dr. Contreras and then come back to questions.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Oakley. Thank you so much. Every time that we've talked or I have heard you present, you have this incredible way of taking very complex data and making it understandable and clear and telling us where we need to focus. So here's this giant chart. Here's where your attention needs to be. And I really appreciate your ability to do that. So thank you. I'm sure we're going to come back to your charts and to those data points as our conversation goes on, because I mean, it's vital to understand where we are and the realities that we're in. So I'm honored to have this conversation today with Dr. Contreras based on so much of the realities that Dr. Oakley has shared with us. Sherry talked some about Dr. Contreras' credentials, but I have to add just how much I admire her work and her advocacy for our kids, from letting going up to DC and letting Congress know why schools need infrastructure money and investment in our schools, advocating at the state level for funding and policy changes. Dr. Contreras, your influence has been broad and deep, bringing really positive attention to the good work going on here in Guilford County. So as a resident, I want to say thank you. I'm excited to have this conversation. And Dr. Oakley just gave us this crash course in the data, but there's so much to dig into there. Before we do that and get lost in the numbers, I'd like to ask, I guess, a more personal question, because when we're talking about these deeply entrenched inequities in our society, I think it's easy sometimes to get lost in the numbers and not connect them to our humanity. And you are a nationally recognized equity warrior, as you put it in your recently published piece. Can you speak to your own story of what sparked that passion in you, that drive toward racial equity and justice in education?
Yeah, thank you. First, just good afternoon to all of you. It's always a pleasure to talk about my passion, and it's a great day to be an educator. In the midst of the pandemic, it is a great day to be superintendent of the Guilford County Schools. And I certainly want to thank Dr. Oakley. I am so blessed to lead an extraordinary team. And the person that prepared the data is Dr. Akeisha Osai-Sarfo, who is one of the best in the country. She's a Harvard Data Fellow who joined us after she completed her fellowship at Harvard. And just so blessed, she is leaving us. She's expecting, but she was able to recruit the accountability officer from Wake County, Dr. Sonia Stevens, who will be joining us. And she is a graduate of the Academy at Lincoln and Dudley High School. So pleased that we'll have a new chief performance officer that will be working with us, who grew up right here in Guilford County. Thank you for your question, Reverend Blosser. It's a great question about how I became so passionate about this work. And it actually started in elementary school. I was bused to school in Long Island, New York, Nassau County, which many people find hard to believe, to desegregate a school. There was a school right down the street. I played at that school every day during the summer, sleigh riding in the winter time, but they needed to desegregate a school in the town. So they bused everybody from my street to that school. And I was always one of just 2 or 3 other children of color in the class. And having 9 siblings, they were most of the other children of color in school with me, the ones that are in my age bracket. But we faced a lot of discrimination in the school. My bus letter was bus A, and the buses would line up in order, but they would park bus A around the corner so the white parents wouldn't be offended by seeing a bus filled with children of color. And I recognized that very early on. And my mother made sure that we had some sense of ourselves. So when we had to do reports in school and things, she made sure, because we weren't being taught about people of color, that we actually did presentations on famous people of color. And I remember the first famous person I learned about was Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who did the first open heart surgery in this country. And I remember doing my 2nd grade book report on him. But the first time I ever learned anything in a textbook about people of color, I remember this so clearly. It said, most African Americans in this country live in American ghettos. That was the line in my 5th grade book, textbook, social studies book. And I knew that right then at 10 years old, that this wasn't right and something had to change. And in 6th grade, and in those days, 6th grade was an elementary school. They had a gifted program. And I tutored almost everybody in my in my classroom, irrespective of race. And these students were going to the gifted class every Monday afternoon, but I wasn't invited. And so I asked my teacher, could I go speak to the gifted teacher? I thought the gifted teacher was making this decision. And Mrs. Dinehart said, no, go sit down, little Sharon. And I said, okay. And then I thought about it and I raised my hand and said, Mrs. Dinehart, may I go to the bathroom, please? And she foolishly gave me that pass. And I marched down to the gifted classroom and pleaded my case, and then shared with my parents. And my parents came up to the school that evening by 4 p.m. And I was in gifted class, and it changed the trajectory of my life. I tell that story all the time because while there are other little Sharon Contrerases that will march down and advocate for themselves, most of the children we serve will not. And that is our role, to stand in the gap.
Wow. I feel like every superhero has an origin story, and that we just got a glimpse at yours, because thank you. In the article that I was referencing, which I believe, Winston, we're going to send to everyone that's on the call afterward, you talk about being in this space and doing the work around race and equity means that you have to become an ambassador of discomfort. And your story already has me squirming a bit in my seat as I think about the decisions of a principal that parks a bus around the corner to keep white people from being uncomfortable. As you look at the data from this year that Dr. Oakley presented and all the other data you're looking at, I'm curious what gives you the most discomfort. What's the data point that you have told your people, we've got to keep an eye on this? This is what is pretending trouble.
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to start off by saying I consistently live with discomfort pre-pandemic, not just for Guilford County, but for our nation's children, and the inequities that persist from generation to generation. And I think it's a good thing that we all have some discomfort, or should have some discomfort. Nothing about what is happening is okay in this country, where groups of children persistently do not reach their potential, their God-given potential. So now, post-pandemic, I'm up at night and my staff laughed. They're like, oh my goodness, the emails, what happened last night? And I said, I look at data, or I read a study, I read current studies that are happening across the country about what's happening to children. And I fear that we will lose a generation, and that our very democracy is in peril because students, one, are not in school. There are lots of children that we cannot find. And the principals, our staff, they're out and about, they're doing everything they can, but they're still trying to run the school in the meantime. So we don't have the sort of community resources to make sure we're out and bringing these children back into school. And I look at these data points, and one good thing is that about 75% of our pre-K through 8 students did choose in-person learning and are back in school. It's a little less altogether. It's about 65% because the high school numbers are lower. And I do think having leadership of color matters in terms of credibility. As I look across the nation, having Mrs. Hayes, the board chair, and a superintendent of color, both saying to Black and brown children, it is okay to come back to school, I think has made a big difference, because my peers are not seeing those large numbers. My peers that lead urban districts in the way, or demographically similar districts. I'm seeing about 11% of students that we've not connected with. I fear not just for their academic safety, but for their mental health, their personal safety. Sex trafficking is occurring. Human trafficking is occurring. We know many of these students are being pulled into very bad situations, abusive situations, and we have to set eyes on them, let them know we love them. We want them back in school. We want them to have better learning outcomes and ultimately better life outcomes, and we're not going to give up on them. That's why many of our resources right now are focused on our incarcerated students and our students at the middle and high school level who have 4 or more risk factors. We are really pouring resources into those children.
So you said 11% of the students you haven't been able to connect with, and that sounds small, but we're talking over like 7,000 kids. Right?
That's right. We may have had some contact at some point, but they are not consistently coming to school. That's over 7,000 children.
And just thinking about dealing, principals and staff dealing with their schools, but then that sheer number of students, that's several high schools worth of students that, discomfort as we look at this. So before we dig into a couple more of these points, I want to clear up, I think, two questions or points of confusion that I think often come up when we start to talk about racial disparities and equity in education. And two of the questions, one is just to clarify the difference between equality and equity when we're talking about how we're allocating resources and what we're talking about when we mean equity. And the second question that I think comes up a bit is just, doesn't poverty explain it? Why are you bringing race into this? If we broke the numbers down by poverty bands, wouldn't that explain it all? So could you just say a word about why poverty isn't enough? We have to also be talking about race, and why we're talking about equity and not equality.
Yeah, so equity simply means making sure students receive what they need so that they can have equal outcomes. So to be equitable means that making sure the students who have the least are provided some more so that they have the same opportunities as their more affluent peers. What was the other question you just asked me?
I often think people go, well, you're making this about race when it's really just about poverty.
Yeah. So it's much more comfortable for us to say this is a result of poverty, because then we feel like we have no onus in this. And no one is saying you're racist, but this is part of this country's racial legacy, because socioeconomic status in this country is tied to race. You can't just separate these two issues or two factors. And so if we're not honest about it, if we don't name it like anything else, you will constantly be sort of like a hamster on a wheel, spinning and spinning, but not really addressing the issue. So without going in and feeling like someone is accusing you of something, we have to realize all of us, irrespective of race, gender, class, we are all impacted by the legacy of American slavery and racism in this country. And we have to own that. We have to understand our historical context, or we'll keep repeating the same mistakes over and over.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. I know you've been really intentional with your staff, even taking a staff retreat to the lynching museum and reading texts and doing training with your staff. I'm wondering if you'd say a bit more about the strategies that you're using to promote racial equity, even pre-pandemic, but certainly now as you're looking at this. What are some of the strategies that GCS is using?
Yeah, so I would say this is incredibly important, and I take no credit for this work starting in this district long ago when Rebecca Buffington was on the board, and Alan Duncan. Dina Hayes has led this charge with now Representative Amos Quick to really make sure we understand our racial history and that we work against these deep inequities in this county, in our schools. And they set the foundation. And I think they were looking for someone that could build upon that work. And I've tried to honor the good work that they started many years ago, 2 decades ago, I believe. But it's hard work. As you see, there's no district in the nation that has closed the achievement gap because it's not just a school district's work. It's related to all of our institutions in our county, our state, and this country. And unless we address the inequities in all American institutions, including the criminal justice system, transportation, housing, employment, there's very little that schools can do. And I believe we have lots of power in school systems, but we can't fix this problem alone. And I think that legislation guided at punishing schools while now not also holding every other American institution accountable is wrongheaded.
So you're saying that teachers alone can't be solely responsible for all racism in the country?
That's right. That's right. That's sort of what we're saying when we just have accountability for schools and no one else, that it's somehow the teacher's fault that students are not achieving. And I do want to point out that great teaching matters. It does. There's study after study. But to close these massive, persistent gaps takes far more. It's way outside of a teacher, principal, superintendent, school board's hand. It's related to inequality in this country.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that, I think one of the compelling things you write about in your article and other work that I've seen you do is bringing to awareness that so much of the racial disparities in U.S. education, we can name practices that on their face seem to have nothing to do with race. So we can talk about school choice and vouchers. We can talk about the admissions process to get into an IB program or students, how the district lines are drawn. And so much of that seems like that, it's race neutral until you look at the data and the data shows you it's absolutely not race neutral. And so I'm curious kind of what policies or practices that you and your team are looking at now or have already been working on that might seem kind of race neutral, but you all know they're having desperate impacts, and kind of how you're addressing those.
Yeah, so one, it would be testing for gifted programs or just using tests as a single factor for a student being placed in a gifted program and not seeing other forms of giftedness other than whether or not someone can perform on a standardized test, or the way in which we assign students, which I think is almost solely the responsible of the school district. And what we hear so often is about the housing patterns, and that is true. But you have to have people on school boards at both the state level and local level who are courageous enough to take this on. One issue I'm facing right now is after the board retreat, I've received quite a bit of pushback at one of the schools that is becoming a magnet. And I understand it because it's the neighborhood school. But what we're trying to do in the Andrews area and in the Smith High School area is provide students with the same choices that their more affluent peers have. And those peers, their parents can buy into a neighborhood with better schools, or they can put their children in private schools. These children cannot. So the board made a concerted effort in November 2019 to say, we will offer choice in both of these areas and create dynamic magnet schools that parents of all races, classes will want to come to. Now, we're going to have to face this a little bit and deal with some of the loss of the neighborhood school, but realize the greater gain is having integrated schools by choice, not by saying we're going to put X number of white kids, X number of Black schools, but creating great schools in every neighborhood. And so I think student assignment is a huge issue in school districts, but one that can be addressed. And another issue I see that, card carrying folks who say, I am a card carrying liberal, they're the first to push back when we say, okay, we're going to place some more kids of color at this school or move the neighborhood, the lines a little bit. They will be the first that come out and push back against school districts. And we saw that in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. It hasn't happened here, but we see it all over the country, the pushback about sharing in the great resources that more affluent children have.
Yeah, you wrote some about this and just shifting how your schools are admitting students into honors programs. And we know that there was some pushback from parents saying, well, you're going to dilute these honors classes. And yet your outcomes seem to show that you have greater diversity in the honors courses and the outcomes of the students are the same. It wasn't watering down the curriculum or anything like that. But I think those are those places of discomfort for a lot of us.
They are, but we have to push back. And I think, what if we had said, people are uncomfortable, we won't push for Brown versus Board of Education and integration of schools? Can we imagine what this country would be like today if we just said, well, people are uncomfortable, we won't do that? Until you experience a new world, your brain sometimes can't conceive that there is a fair way of doing, or more fair way of doing the work.
Yeah. So I want to address something that Dr. Oakley pointed out in the data, because she was really showing the positive impact of having kids physically in school, especially our youngest kids. I was really taken aback by just the impact of 5 weeks of half-day school for kindergartners and how that benefited them over their first and second grade peers that hadn't had that opportunity in those test scores. And it made me think that, what I'm hearing from a lot of folks in Black and Brown communities is a high anxiety around sending their kids back to school, because for a whole host of structural and social issues, they know that if COVID comes into their family, they're going to have worse health outcomes than their white counterparts might. Access to health care, comorbidities that were within the family, multi-generational family units, all of these things contribute to worse health outcomes if they get COVID. So there's a deep anxiety about sending kids to school. And yet we saw in that data how vital it is for the kids to be in school. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about how GCS is kind of speaking to those families or trying to work with that twin pressure that I'm sure you're seeing as parents want to do what's best for their kids, but sometimes they feel like their education and their health might be in conflict.
Yeah, I certainly understand where the angst comes from, but we also have to understand how various communities receive information, and we have to act accordingly. And we know many communities of color get their information from social media. That means you have to use that tool more wisely to reach out to communities of color. They're not going to simply read the newspaper as much as they listen to word of mouth, who's in the barbershops, the faith community. So we have to reach out to communities and use the communication mechanisms and tools that they are most likely to use. And we try to study that. Dr. Carr is phenomenal at really looking at, by race, socioeconomic status, how people use or receive information. And we try to act in that way. We also have some principals who are actually phenomenal at this. One in High Point is Marcus Gauss at Andrews High School, who gets out there. Certainly Mike Hedenbach at Southwest Guilford High School. They get out there and get to the kids. In Greensboro, Lee Williams knocked on every door of every home. The principal at Hairston, the students who needed to be in school the most. And when we first asked parents, how many are coming back? Only like 20% of his school said they were coming back. He's at 100% right now. By going to the door, and then some he couldn't reach because many of the families had moved. He threw a big like hot dog thing in his parking lot to get them there and get them to sign, "I'm coming into school." But you got to have some credibility with your families and with your parents. And I can name many other parents or principals, but those are the ones that just stand out in my mind for going out, reaching out, and getting our families, much in the way the faith community does when they think about saving souls. You know, we got to go out and get them. That's the work we have to do in schools. And, you know, I always laugh when I walk into a school and I look and I see the principal behind the desk and not with, you know, sneakers on and things. I'm like, not a whole lot going.
I think Dr. Contreras just froze on us, or I froze.
I think the internet downtown might have frozen a little for a brief moment. I think they will get it back.
Is Dr. Oakley still on the call here with us?
No, she had to jump off for another meeting.
Well, I'm wondering, as Dr. Contreras is kind of getting her online back up, Winston, if maybe, as she was starting to lead us into this conversation about credibility and kind of getting the word out about this, and as a leader of GEA and on our school board, we've got a number of people representing NAACP of High Point, Guilford for All, High Point Schools Partnership, all these community groups that have credibility with groups. What's your sense of what groups like GEA, like what should we be doing now to be supporting this work that Guilford County Schools is doing?
Yeah, I mean, right, that's the quintessential question we wake up and ask every day, and all of you involved in the Alliance do. I do think the more we learn and gather like this and understand and feel confident, I mean, increasingly, I see where advocacy is and experience it as relational. You know, we send out e-blasts, but you know, the people who open those e-blasts are people we've been in relationship. Right? You don't build coalitions and build stickiness in movements without relationships. And so, and that requires some time, right? Relationships, you don't just form them on a dime. So it's helpful to see people showing back up, talking to one another, learning, unpacking these issues, because then when you are in conversation with colleagues, with family members, with neighbors, you begin to spread that, because you say, I was talking about this yesterday, this is what's really happening. You know, people may get their news from social media, but they really trust the people they're in relationship with. So the best way to sort of break down myths or misconceptions is because someone they trust, they've talked to. And so there's no shortcuts. That's the thing. Advocacy happens on a long arc because you can't shortcut relationships. So I do think there are things we can be fighting for and helping people understand why it matters. So why does it matter to adequately staff the administration and the support staff in schools, not just teachers? Now, we should adequately staff teachers. So none of it means, of course, we should adequately staff teachers. We should pour into them the professional development they need. We should also allow them to teach. And then other support personnel can really be then digging into social and emotional needs of students. They can be going into neighborhoods and building relationship and credibility, identifying some of those barriers that kids may be facing so they can come back to the school and then problem solve with their teams how to address those. But you got to have people to be in relationship with students and families in order to do that. So the more that we cut the people in our budgets, the less people we have to do that work. Trained people who are there over time. Sharon, we're glad to have you back.
They switched me to, I ran all the way across the office to another laptop, but the computer completely shut down. I apologize for that.
That's all right.
No worries. We're just having a conversation about picking up on exactly what you were talking about. thinking about ways of building trust within community groups. I was, talking to Winston and saying, like, look, GEA, High Point Schools Partnership, the NAACP, Guilford for All, you've got all of these community groups that want equity in education. And I think the question is, what do we do? So from your perspective, from GCS, what would be your charge to a group like the High Point Schools Partnership or the NAACP or GEA? I mean, how can we support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think, again, another just phenomenal question, because as I stated previously, the schools are not going to be able to address all of this inequity or the remnants of this, the inequities in this country by themselves. So it requires that organizations and, even city government look at some of their practices. They have to look at, like, zoning, for example. We need more mixed income housing so that school systems, the schools aren't reflective of very segregated neighborhoods. We have to look at employment. And one thing we're doing in the district with our career technical education and the facilities plan, passing that bond first, thank you, but also knowing in 2022, we're coming back because we can create schools that prepare students for great careers. So we see that right now at some of the schools where we did just initial work on this. We had our board retreat at Western Guilford, and we want to showcase some of the other schools that we've done some renovations at already. So that's important. Looking at every institution in the community to say, how can this organization, this institution be more equitable, implement more equitable practices? We have, some of you have been through the groundwater study that Chairwoman Dina Hayes does. We actually look at which of our employees are promoted, how much do they make? And we notice that the employees that make the least are the ones most likely to have children in the district. Our transportation department staff, our school nutrition staff, they're also the ones who make the least amount of money. This has an impact on whether or not those students get out of poverty. And so we have to consider that and consider the minimum wage rate right now and trying to raise that so that they actually can own homes. Anyone that works 40 hours a week and works hard should be able to purchase a home in this country. And we have to start thinking about policies at every level of government and how the organizations in High Point and across Guilford County can start advocating for more just policies.
I mean, one of my favorite things about listening to you is your ability to have a very fine-tuned, specific, in the weeds thing that we need to do. And also, here's what we have to do as a whole structure and a whole nation, and connect those two things together. And I think that, I mean, that's something that a lot of us really struggle to see how this, a minimum wage argument or zoning arguments or just our transportation lines might be directly influencing outcomes for kids. And so you started to already speak to this, but you run a consolidated countywide school system, but a lot of residents of Guilford County first identify with their cities. I'm a High Pointer. As we kind of think about our own worlds that we're in, while the cities don't run the school system, what ought the cities be doing? Are there things that we can be advocating to our city councils and our city leadership to say, here are some changes that we need to make as a city to help support education for kids?
Yeah. So, I often am asked, what can we do? And it feels really good to have something tangible, like we want to give calculators, we want to give laptops, but charity is not justice. We have to remember that. And it only goes so far. It's a short-term solution. And we're so grateful because we wouldn't have made it if we didn't get the calculator donations, the laptop donations. But what really help is if parents make a living wage and can buy a laptop, and they have laptops. But we need the advocacy. I say this so often, and I think it's the thing most people are least comfortable with, but the advocacy matters. There's no reason in 2021 that there are communities with no broadband connectivity. City government can work on that. State government, federal government should work on that and advocate for broadband connectivity in the same way we did for electricity in the 1930s. And we made this a public commodity. This just isn't okay. We have to advocate for mixed income communities. We have to advocate that teachers and police officers and firefighters live in the communities that they serve. These are very tangible things that have been shown to end massive inequality in this country, and it will end inequality in our communities in High Point in Guilford County.
I think April Parker has pulled, maybe the quote of the session here, this charities are not justice, right? Mm-hmm. And thinking about the policies that we need to be advocating around, where these external groups that I've mentioned really can have influence because they can help get their grassroots folks together to advocate for changes at city and county policy and even state policy level. I think just thinking about how this pandemic might have been different if we all had broadband, mm-hmm. and that wasn't something that your staff had to spend hours and hours and hours of time trying to figure out how to get buses with Wi-Fi hotspots to kids and get them a laptop.
Yeah, and and people blame the school system not knowing this is such a bigger issue. And there are billions of dollars at the FCC's disposal that they could be providing to public libraries and school systems to make sure all Americans have access to broadband connectivity. This is not another battle that superintendents and school boards should be fighting. And, there's so many, I know we think that there's just a sort of a spirit of not wanting to, not valuing education. That's just not true. Marcus Gall shared with me yesterday, a student showed up with her backpack, a diaper bag on her back, and the baby on her chest because she couldn't get childcare. And I said, do not send that child away. We can figure this out. But she was determined to get an education. But students should not have to show this sort of grit and resilience for something that should just be part of their normal childhood, coming to school and being able to come to school without a struggle. So there's so much we can do to support children, like placing daycare centers in some of these high schools will ensure that those who are pregnant and parenting graduate. And that improves not just that individual's life, but the quality of life in High Point, in Greensboro, in the county.
Yeah, I think Heidi Majors is on the call here, and the YWCA in High Point has a youth adolescent parenting program that between them and the Foundation for Healthy High Point have really pointed to the fact in parts of High Point we've got 200 out of every 1,000 young women in High Point are pregnant or get pregnant sometime between 15 and 19, and thinking about how our schools support, how do we as a community support these kids in this pathway to education? I think we need to do more, I think, to support the schools and not put all that on the schools. I want to so folks who are on the call here, please enter questions in the chat. I'm going to start pulling some of these questions out of the chat because we've had some really thoughtful folks who are on the call that I think want to get Dr. Contreras' perspective on a few things. I want to pull a question here from Keith Thunderberg, who asks, how is GCS addressing the social and emotional needs for Black and Brown students during this time?
Yeah, this is an area I would say needs much strengthening because we don't have a lot of support staff. We have counselors. We're one of the first in the nation to put together a 24-hour crisis hotline that actually saved a student's life that was going to commit suicide. And we were able to get the police to the home. But we don't have enough clinicians. And even if we were given the money today, there aren't the number of clinicians in the county. So developing these programs while students are still in high school, making sure we pay for their college and they come back and give to the community so that we can provide these sort of supports for students. Do we have some? Absolutely. And we have a strong network where we're able to guide families and students to community resources, but we certainly don't have the robust sort of system that I believe a school district should have. In my last system, we had 11 to 21 additional support staff just for mental health in every school in the district. And we also worked to receive federal funding for mental health clinics in every single school. It can be done. We just have to have the will to do it.
And I think Winston's been monitoring the chat here closely and has a couple questions she wants to pull out.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think one may seem like a basic question, but it goes back to the slides and really the purpose and focus of this whole conversation, which is, I think we often have trouble wrapping our heads around why exactly are kids of color underperforming, right? It's like this simple question. That you see it over and over again. So in a way, as if you were explaining this to someone for the first time, right? Why are we seeing these kids of color consistently underperform? Is it that they're actually underperforming, that we aren't measuring the right things? Is it the legacy of poverty? Could you just speak to that again? I know you've spoken to it a million times and you act in it, every day.
And so there are various reasons. The first is just the legacy of American slavery in this country. So these students are the great grandchildren of people who did not have access to education. And in fact, even the students in school today, some of their grandparents didn't have access to an equitable education. If you just follow the history of legislation passed over the years in North Carolina, you will see that we still had segregated schools in the 1960s, early in the 1970s. So this doesn't just change overnight. And certainly, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Student outcomes are related to socioeconomic status. So if parents are undereducated, grandparents are undereducated, if they were not homeowners, do not have wealth to pass on from generation to generation, you're going to see that cycle continue until we address the racial wealth gap in this country. And that means all of the institutions outside of public schools have to address that. Now, within a school, I have to make sure students have the highest quality teachers, and we've been able to start providing through CARES Act money $30,000 signing bonuses for highly effective teachers. We place them in schools like Andrews, GTCC, High Point, Northwood, Oak Hill, Oakview, Penn Griffin, and Union Hill in the High Point area. And we intend to use some of the $80 million we're about to receive for that. We also have to provide a high quality curriculum. For many years, the prevailing thought was just let teachers teach what they want to teach because they know best. Well, the research doesn't indicate that. The research shows teachers know pedagogy best, not necessarily how to design curriculum. And I'm really hopeful about some legislation that is about to pass on the science of reading. And our state superintendent, Catherine Truitt, has really been pushing on this. We taught balanced literacy for years, and there was no science behind that, not just here, across the country, no science behind it. And generations of children, white, Black, rich, poor, cannot read today because of that. So teaching matters, the teachers matter, great principals matter, and support structures matter in public schools. So yes, do I own some of this? Absolutely. But everybody has to address the institutions that surround and wrap which school districts work and exist.
And, I think April Parker says this brilliantly, as she does many things, which is we can't always describe the conditions of Blackness without explicitly discussing the benefits of whiteness. And so we often phrase this equity question as a problem with students of color and not as a privilege or a benefit or a system. Why is the system rigged to benefit me, as a white girl in particular, who seem to be doing pretty well? And I think one specific way somebody asked a question that we see how that's tied to the race of teachers, that there is data that shows that students respond well to teachers who look like them. That doesn't mean that you can't learn from teachers who don't look like you. But could you speak to some of that data and the work that you've done to recruit teachers and principals and leaders that reflect our community and what kind of outcomes we see when we do that?
Yeah, so there is extensive research now that students who have a teacher that looks like them, particularly Black students and Hispanic students, are more likely to graduate from high school and go on and do well. Certainly, that's my own story. I have about 4 points in my life or incidences that I can point to that catapulted me to where I am today. And one was my middle school teacher, the only Black teacher I ever had, and I never had a Hispanic teacher. But I became a teacher because of Mrs. Hargrove. So that research is really powerful, but I want to caution us that the racism we see happening in schools happens even from teachers of color, because at one time, teachers of color could only live in segregated neighborhoods. But at that point, they had a closer relationship with students. So I don't want us to ever believe that white teachers can't do a great job with teaching children of color, or that all Black teachers are doing a phenomenal job. That's just not true. We have to make all educators aware of the impact of our racial history, understand poverty, so that students are performing well. It's not lost on me the high failure rates we're seeing in a district where 40% of the teachers are Black.
Mm-hmm. There was also a question about the rich choices that are available, and that I know we've talked some about that in the facilities plan, and you touched on that in creating the choice zones. Can you say something about integration through choice and the vision that you have and that the board has developed in the community around the choices that we can offer students and what difference that might make?
I'm really excited about rethinking our choices. And I think the district has done a good job with this, but over time, every decade, you need to rethink your choices. And actually, every few years, as new jobs are being created, some jobs that we hadn't even envisioned 5 years ago, and that will continue to happen, you have to rethink the choices that you offer. Right now, our magnet schools are for the most part, schools that our children of color desire to attend. They are the ones saying we want choice. And so whenever a magnet school doesn't attract students from every race, SES, you have to start thinking perhaps the magnet thing needs to be revisited. And that's the work that this board did over the last 2 years. While thinking through the facilities plan. And many districts just come up with a facilities plan and say, these are the schools that need to be fixed. But you have to think about program and how to create great schools in every single neighborhood that will be integrated because parents choose to integrate them because they are great programs and they know their child will receive a good education. So we're really excited about the career technical education programs and the new magnets we're creating that include artificial intelligence, art school, elementary art school, finally, going to a middle and high school arts magnet in both Greensboro and High Point. I mean, just the list, I could go on and on, but it's so exciting planning this for our community. And I think what we have to manage is just the sense of, oh my goodness, how can you, get rid of my beloved school? Well, in that beloved school, not all students are achieving, and we have to say it. It doesn't mean we're not proud of our community, but we have to really go from good to great. And you all remember from that book, good is the enemy of great. Just saying it's working isn't good enough anymore and won't ensure our students have post-secondary success. I'm excited about Andrews moving toward a police and fire academy so we can grow more Black and brown officers and firefighters, and Southwest Guilford High School having a program for tourism and hospitality. But we have to rethink this every few years to make sure we're offering programs that parents and students desire and that will lead to a middle-class life for our students.
Yeah, I think you're also starting to address the importance of why another bond issue might be very important for addressing these issues of equity and outcomes. Because the next bond would be really important to creating more of these choice opportunities, right?
Could you say that one more time, please?
Well, it's sounding like, the first bond is going to help us do some helpful work, but it's nowhere near what is actually required to take the schools to the point where the facilities themselves would allow for these kinds of academies, the kind of choice that would facilitate that kind of vision of greatness that you're talking about.
Absolutely. It is imperative that we pass this next bond so that every single school in Guilford County will be touched and that we experience this full choice. One of the options is to move to a 612 Allen J in High Point, to have a 612 model by buying a parcel of land and starting to build a new school, and then also having one at the old at Jackson School in Greensboro, having an Allen J Prep East. It's the most overchosen school in High Point, but we're certainly missing so many students who could benefit from an education there. And we have to really push to make sure this happens in this community, that bond is passed in 2022, I hope. And then the icing on the cake, the cherry on top, is the number of jobs that will bring to Guilford County, to High Point, Greensboro, and the county as a whole.
Well, I think you've just started to bring it all full circle, right? Because with those jobs comes better pay, helps lift families out of poverty, helps kids get the access to the resources and you start to see this systemic change that you're talking about, and not just the incrementalism that we so often, while it's good, that's often where we leave it, is with the incrementalism and not that vision of transformative change that I think you've just offered.
Absolutely. We have to transform it. We can't keep tinkering with this thing. We've done that for 100 years. Just think about it. We've tried for 100 years. We have to transform the system. That means transforming all American institutions and thinking about the interrelatedness of American institutions so that we think about this change as a system. And far too often we say, okay, let's address housing, or let's address schools, but we never say, how do we address housing, schools, transportation, the criminal justice system, all together? And I would offer, it's not going to happen until we think about it in that way.
Yeah, that's such a helpful, I think, a closing comment to bring us, our minds kind of wrap around the enormity of the challenge and also the potential. And I want to first urge everyone to go look at the chat, because there are so many brilliant comments and questions that have come through the chat that we couldn't get to, but you will all be enlightened if you can go and look there for a moment. But I want to turn things over here with a big thank you to Dr. Contreras for her time, her energy, everything that she and her staff are doing every day, from knocking on doors to try to get these kids connected to the resources that our schools have to offer. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to kind of draw us together, I think this idea of the bond leads us to our closer here, my good friend and co-conspirator, Reverend Frank Thomas. He's always getting into good trouble, as John Lewis would say. Frank is the co-chair of the Smart Bond Committee. He's the pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in High Point. He's a recent NCCJ Citation Award winner, and he's spending a lot of his time advocating for our students and our schools. So before I kick it to Frank, though, I want to let everybody know that you are going to get a follow-up email from GEA that I think will have this slide deck in it that Dr. Oakley shared. It'll have Dr. Contreras and Nora Carr's piece on being equity warriors with it. So from me, thank you, Dr. Contreras. Thank you, everyone who's here. Let me kick it over to Reverend Frank Thomas.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you so much to Dr. Contreras. You always inspire me whenever I hear you. And there's so much that we can glean from our conversation today. And just a few things that I picked up and I want to highlight. One of the issues that we have with our children of color is the lack of Black history being taught in the schools. So I want to share something real quickly that I saw this week. How American schools teach Black history. First off, all Black people were slaves. Then Abe Lincoln freed y'all. Then nothing relevant happened until the Civil Rights Movement. Then MLK had a dream. Then a bunch of y'all started playing sports and doing music and movies. And then we let y'all have Barack Obama, the end. It's pretty powerful. But some people, unfortunately, still think and feel that way about the history of Black America. And part of that issue is, like Dr. Contreras, many times our Black students don't have anybody that looks like them, so they feel like they don't have anything to aspire to. I'll hit the bond right quick. One of the reasons that we have to go to this next bond is just so people understand, the facilities master plan is north of $2 billion. That would touch every school in our district. The school board asked the county commissioners to put $1.6 billion on the ballot. The community went to the school, the county commissioners, and said, well, if 1.6 is too high a number, maybe 900 million would be a good number to land on. And they came back with 300 million. So just let that sink in for a minute and helps you to understand why we have to do another round of bonds already. So everybody on this call, I want to help ask you to start advocating and start beating the streets and start helping people understand that when you say, well, we just did 300 million, well, that was just the start. It was just the tip of the iceberg, and we have a long way to go. And we talked about equity and equality. Equality is giving everybody a pair of shoes. Equity is giving everybody a pair of shoes that fit. We can't give every child in our district the same thing and expect the same outcomes. Finally, I want to share the words of one of my devotionals this morning. I start my morning every morning with devotionals, and this I thought was helpful for us. In Deuteronomy 6, Moses took the opportunity to teach biblical truths to children, so children become familiar with them and make them part of their lives. By using their interest as teaching opportunities to repeat Bible stories so they become recognizable while modeling a godly life before them. That's the acronym FIRM, F-I-R-M, a firm foundation. In our schools, we can likewise share and give our children a firm foundation if we give them and share with them things that are familiar to them, like in-person school. That's familiar, and then do things that are interesting to them that will spark their interest and make them want to do more, and then do things that are recognizable and give them recognition. Maybe show them something that they can recognize, and then we as adults should model the best practices so our children can have a firm foundation. You might ask, somebody put in the chat, well, what can we do now? I've often said to Joe and other friends of mine, oppression of any type will never cease as long as the oppressed are the only ones talking about it. It's going to take people who look like the oppressor, who the oppressor listens to and can relate to, has to stand up, raise their hand, and say enough. Whether that's an individual, whether that's a community, whether that's an organization, but as long as people of color are the only ones talking about the disparities of color, it's going to take people like Joe Blosser, and I thank God for you, my brother. It's going to take people like Joe Blosser, Winston McGregor, and others who say enough is enough, and we're going to do something about it to make a difference in our community. And we can make a difference. We can't save all the starfish, but I can save one. So we have to start with one, but don't rest and be happy with the one that you saved. Just know that the mission field is great, and we all have to do our part in order for all of our children to be successful and vibrant and in our schools doing well in all ways. God bless you all, and I thank God for this time together. Look forward to hearing more about the Smart Bond campaign that we are just getting started, but we're going to come back with a vengeance. And Commissioner Alston has already told us that the county commissioners are going to do all they can while they can to get this done. We look forward to seeing you real soon.